For hours. That's all it took for one man to send a message so brutal, so calculated, that the Ku Klux Klan would never set foot in Harlem again. The year was 1936. A night that started with burning crosses and racial slurs ended with something far darker. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a saint. He was a gangster, a numbers runner, a man who ruled Harlem's underworld with an iron fist. But when the KKK torched his club and threatened his people, they made one fatal mistake. They underestimated him. What happened in those 4 hours became legend. Bodies were found. Messages were delivered. And by sunrise, the streets whispered a name with equal parts fear and respect. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about power, survival, and what happens when you push the wrong man too far. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't just fight back. He made sure they'd never forget. Harlem in the 1930s wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a world unto itself. A place where jazz spilled out of basement clubs at 3 in the morning, where poets and pimps shared the same street corners, where Black Americans carved out dignity in a country that refused to give it to them. The Renaissance was fading, but the spirit remained. Defiant, unbreakable, and in the center of it all stood Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. The name came from a childhood injury, a bump on the back of his head that never quite went away. But it suited him for other reasons too. Because Bumpy had a way of being exactly where he needed to be, exactly when chaos was about to erupt. He wasn't the flashiest gangster in New York. That title belonged to men like Dutch Schultz and Lucky Luciano. But Bumpy was something different. He was Harlem's protector, its enforcer, its dark guardian. He ran the numbers racket with ruthless efficiency. Took a cut from every hustle, every game, every underground operation from 110th Street to 155th. But he also kept the peace, settled disputes, made sure the neighborhood didn't tear itself apart. The Italian mob controlled most of Manhattan. The Irish ruled Hell's Kitchen. And Bumpy? He held Harlem, not through alliances or political connections, through respect and fear in equal measure. By 1936, he'd already served time in Sing Sing, already made enemies of men who thought they could muscle into his territory, already buried those who tried. His club, the Rhythm Room, sat on Lenox Avenue like a crown jewel. It wasn't the biggest venue in Harlem. It wasn't the fanciest, but it was his. A place where musicians came to play, where locals came to drink and forget their troubles for a few hours, where Bumpy conducted business away from prying eyes. The club represented something beyond profit. It was a symbol of Black ownership, of autonomy, of a community that refused to bow. And that's exactly why the Klan targeted it. Because in 1936, the KKK wasn't just lynching in the South. They were organizing in northern cities, recruiting, spreading their poison into neighborhoods they considered infested. Harlem was on their list, and Bumpy Johnson was the name at the top. The threat started 3 weeks before the attack. Anonymous letters slipped under doorways. Crude drawings of nooses left on car windshields. Whispers in the streets about keeping Harlem in its place. Most people ignored them. Harassment from white supremacists wasn't new. It was background noise in a city where racism wore 1,000 different masks. But Bumpy didn't ignore anything. He had informants throughout the city, cops on his payroll, bartenders who listened to loose talk from drunk patrons. And what he heard troubled him. The Klan was organizing, not just street-level thugs looking to burn a cross and disappear. This was coordinated, planned. They'd been meeting in basements in Queens, in abandoned warehouses in the Bronx, building toward something. Bumpy called a meeting with his lieutenants. 6 men sat around a back table at the Rhythm Room, smoke curling toward the ceiling, drinks untouched. "They're coming," Bumpy said. His voice was calm. It was always calm. That's what made it terrifying. "I don't know when, but they're coming." One of his men, an enforcer named Jericho, leaned forward. "Let them come. We'll be ready." Bumpy shook his head. "Ready isn't enough. We need to know their move before they make it." He had people watching, following known Klan members, tracking cars with out-of-state plates that lingered too long in Harlem, noting faces that didn't belong. The tension in the neighborhood was thick enough to cut. Shop owners stayed open later, watching their windows. Young men carried weapons they'd never needed before. Even the music in the clubs felt different. Sharper, more urgent, like everyone was waiting for a storm they could feel but couldn't see. Bumpy increased security at the Rhythm Room. 2 men at the door instead of 1. a third watching from across the street. He varied his schedule, never arriving or leaving at the same time twice. These weren't the actions of a paranoid man. They were the calculations of someone who'd survived this long by trusting his instincts. On a Tuesday night in late September, one of his informants brought news. A cop who'd been taking Bumpy's money for 5 years. "There's talk," the cop said, nervously adjusting his hat. "Something big. This weekend. They're calling it a cleansing." Bumpy's jaw tightened. "Where?" The cop shrugged. "They're keeping it tight. But your name came up. And the club." Bumpy handed him an envelope. "Thicker than usual. Keep listening. I need specifics." But specifics never came. Because the Klan had learned from past mistakes. They'd compartmentalized their operation. Only the leaders knew the full plan. Everyone else got pieces. Fragments. Just enough to play their part. Friday came. The rhythm room was packed. A saxophone player from New Orleans was headlining. The crowd was electric. Dancing. Laughing. For a few hours, the world outside didn't exist. Bumpy sat at his usual table in the back. Eyes always moving. Watching the door. Watching the windows. Watching faces. Something felt wrong. He couldn't name it. Couldn't point to a specific detail that set off alarms. But 30 years of survival had taught him to trust that feeling. At midnight, he told his security to double-check the perimeter. They found nothing. No suspicious cars. No lurking figures. The street looked normal. But normal was a lie. Because 3 blocks away, in the basement of an abandoned church, 23 men in white robes were preparing. Gasoline cans. Torches. Baseball bats wrapped in barbed wire. And a list. The rhythm room was first. Then the barber shop on 125th. Then the community center where kids learned to read. They weren't just attacking Bumpy. They were attacking the idea of Harlem itself. The pride. The resistance. The refusal to disappear. At 2 in the morning, the club started to empty. Musicians packed their instruments. Couples stumbled out onto Lenox Avenue, arms wrapped around each other. The bartender wiped down the counter. Everything seemed normal. Bumpy stayed late. He always did. Counting receipts. Making notes. Planning the next week's operations. 2 of his men remained with him. Jericho and a younger enforcer named Curtis. Outside, the street was quiet. Too quiet. No traffic. No voices. Just the hum of distant city noise. Then they smelled it. Gasoline. Bumpy's head snapped up. He moved to the window. And that's when he saw them. White robes glowing in the streetlights. 20, maybe 25 men. Some carrying torches. Others holding weapons. They weren't hiding. Weren't sneaking. They wanted to be seen. Wanted the fear. One of them threw something through the front window. Glass exploded inward. A Molotov cocktail. Flames erupted across the floor. Another bottle. Then another. The rhythm room, the symbol of Black Harlem's defiance, was burning. And Bumpy Johnson stood in the middle of it, watching the men who thought they could destroy everything he'd built. They had no idea what they'd just started. The heat hit first. Then the smoke. Thick, black, choking. Curtis started toward the back exit, but Bumpy grabbed his arm. Not yet. His voice cut through the crackling flames. Outside, the Klan members were chanting. Racial slurs. Threats. The kind of venom that had echoed through southern towns for decades. But this wasn't the South. This was Harlem. And they'd just made a declaration of war on the wrong man. Bumpy watched them through the smoke. Counted heads. Noted positions. Saw which ones carried guns, which ones just had bats and chains. Leadership stood in the back. 3 men without hoods. Confident. Smiling. They thought this was the end of something. They had no idea it was the beginning. "Jericho," Bumpy said, his eyes never leaving the street. "Get to the phone in the back office. Make the calls. All of them." Jericho didn't ask questions. He disappeared into the smoke. Curtis looked at Bumpy, confused. "Boss, we need to leave. This whole place is going up." Bumpy finally turned away from the window. His face was calm, eerily calm, like he was standing in a church instead of a burning building. "Let it burn," he said. "It's just wood and brick. We can rebuild wood and brick." They moved through the back, flames licking at the walls, ceiling starting to collapse. The office was untouched yet. Jericho was already on the phone, speaking in code. Quick. Efficient. By the time they made it out the rear exit into the alley, the front of the rhythm room was completely engulfed. The Klan was still out front. Still chanting. Still celebrating. They didn't know Bumpy had escaped. Didn't know he was already moving. The 3 men slipped through back alleys, moving with the practiced ease of people who knew every corner, every shortcut, every shadow in Harlem. Bumpy didn't run. He walked. Purposeful. Controlled. They reached a brownstone on 132nd Street. Bumpy's real headquarters. The club was for show, for business, for the public face of his operation. This place was where the serious work happened. Inside, men were already gathering. Word traveled fast in Harlem. Faster than fire. Faster than hate. Within 20 minutes, there were 15 men in the room. Within an hour, 40. These weren't just gang members. They were veterans. Men who'd fought in the Great War and come home to a country that still treated them like second-class citizens. They were dock workers with sledgehammers, porters with knives, musicians with guns hidden in instrument cases. Bumpy stood at the head of the table. Everyone fell silent. "They burned my club," he said. Simple. Factual. No emotion. "They came into our neighborhood, our home, and they tried to send a message." He paused. Let the words sink in. "So we're going to send one back." Someone asked the obvious question. "What do you want us to do?" Bumpy smiled. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "I want them found. Every single one of them. I want to know where they're celebrating, where they think they're safe. And I want it done in 4 hours." The room erupted in movement. Men grabbed weapons, made phone calls, spread out into the night. Bumpy had built a network over 15 years. Informants, allies, people who owed him favors, people who feared him, people who respected him. All of it activated in minutes. This wasn't random violence. This was precision. One informant reported Klan members drinking at a bar in Astoria. Another spotted 3 cars heading toward a warehouse in Long Island City. A third saw robed figures near a printing shop in the Bronx. Bumpy plotted it all on a map. Saw the pattern. They weren't scattered. They were regrouping. Probably planning their next target. Probably toasting their success. Jericho approached with new information. "We found their leader. Guy named Howard Finch. Real estate developer from Connecticut. He's at a hotel in Midtown. Room 412. Bumpy's expression didn't change. "How many with him?" 2 bodyguards. Maybe 3. Bumpy looked at the map again. At all the pieces moving into place. At the scattered cells of white supremacists who thought they could terrorize Harlem and disappear into the night. "Split into teams," he ordered. "I want simultaneous hits. No one escapes. No one talks. No one ever forgets what happens when you come for what's mine." The men moved with military precision. This wasn't their first operation. Bumpy had trained them well. Some headed to Queens. Others to the Bronx. A select group, led by Bumpy himself, went toward Midtown. The clock was ticking. It was 3 in the morning. By 7, the sun would rise. By 7, Bumpy wanted every man who'd thrown a torch to understand the cost. The streets were empty. New York in the dead hours between night and morning. When the city held its breath. When anything could happen. And something was about to. The hotel stood on 42nd Street. 12 stories of brick and pretension. The kind of place where businessmen stayed when they came to the city for deals that required discretion. The lobby was dimmed. A single clerk dozed behind the desk. A porter smoked near the entrance. Normal. Quiet. Unsuspecting. Bumpy entered alone. Dressed in an expensive suit. Hat pulled low, but not suspicious. He looked like any other guest returning from a late night. The clerk barely glanced up. Bumpy walked past the elevator. Took the stairs. His footsteps silent on the carpeted steps. Behind him, 3 of his men entered through a service entrance. They'd worked in hotels before. Knew the layout. Knew which doors were watched and which were forgotten. 4th floor. The hallway stretched out in both directions. Dim lights. Thick carpet that swallowed sound. Room 412 was at the end. Light showed under the door. Voices inside. Laughter. They were celebrating. Bumpy stood outside the door for a moment. Listening. 3 distinct voices. Maybe 4. One of them was louder than the others. Drunk. Boasting about how the coloreds ran like scared dogs when the flames started. How Harlem would think twice before getting uppity again. How this was just the beginning. Bumpy knocked. Professional. Polite. Like hotel staff. The voices stopped. Footsteps approached the door. "Yeah." A gruff voice. Suspicious, but not alarmed. "Room service, sir." Complimentary bottle from management. A pause. Then the lock clicked. The door opened 6 inches. A man's face appeared in the gap. Middle-aged. Flushed from drinking. His expression changed when he saw Bumpy. Not room service. Not white. Not what he expected. He tried to slam the door. Bumpy's foot was already in the gap. The door crashed back open. Bumpy moved inside like water. Smooth. Unstoppable. The bodyguard stumbled backward, reaching for a gun on the table. He never made it. Jericho came through the door behind Bumpy. One punch. The bodyguard dropped. The second man lunged from the bathroom. Curtis met him halfway. A brief struggle. Then silence. And there, in the center of the room, sat Howard Finch. Still in his white robe. Hood pulled back. Sweating despite the cool night air. A glass of whiskey frozen halfway to his lips. He was younger than Bumpy expected. Maybe 40. Soft hands. Expensive watch. The kind of man who'd never faced real consequences for anything in his life. Bumpy Johnson, Finch said. His voice tried for confidence. Missed. You can't just walk in here. You know who I am. Who my family is. Bumpy sat down in the chair opposite him. Casual. Like they were old friends catching up. I know exactly who you are. Real estate developer. Member of the New York Athletic Club. Donate to the mayor's campaign. And Grand Dragon of the New York chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Finch's face paled. You've got no proof of that. Bumpy gestured to the white robe. I'm looking at it. Outside the window, the city continued its sleep. Unaware. Uncaring. In rooms across Queens and the Bronx, similar scenes were unfolding. Klan members being pulled from beds. Dragged from celebration dinners. Found in warehouses where they thought they were safe. Bumpy's network was surgical. Every target identified. Every location confirmed. Every move coordinated. This wasn't random gang violence. This was strategy. Back in the hotel room, Finch was talking. Trying to negotiate. Offering money. Offering to call off future attacks. Offering everything except what Bumpy actually wanted. Understanding. You burned my club, Bumpy said quietly. You came into my neighborhood. Threatened my people. And you thought what? That we'd just accept it? That we'd be too scared to respond? Finch's hands trembled. It was just business. Nothing personal. We were sending a message about property values, about keeping neighborhoods pure. Bumpy finished. That the word you're looking for? Silence. Bumpy stood, walked to the window, looked out at the city, at the lights that never quite went out, at the streets where power shifted in the darkness. Here's what's going to happen, he said, not turning around. You're going to leave New York. Tonight. You're going to disband your chapter. You're going to tell every white hood in this city that Harlem is off limits. Forever. Finch laughed. Nervous. Disbelieving. Or what? You'll kill me? I've got connections. The police. City Hall. You touch me, and Bumpy turned. His eyes were cold. Empty. Like looking into a well with no bottom. I don't need to kill you. I just need to make sure you understand. Really understand. What happens when you push? He nodded to Jericho. What happened next took less than 5 minutes. But it was 5 minutes Howard Finch would remember for the rest of his life. No bones broken. No permanent damage. Just pain. And fear. And the absolute certainty that Bumpy Johnson wasn't making idle threats. When it was over, Finch was on the floor. Crying. Begging. All the superiority stripped away. Just a man who'd finally met someone he couldn't buy or intimidate or destroy. Bumpy leaned down. Spoke softly. Sunrise is in 3 hours. I want you on a train heading south. I want your people scattered. And I never want to hear about white robes in Harlem again. He stood. Adjusted his suit. Walked toward the door. Paused. Oh, and Finch. Tell them what happened here tonight. Tell them all. I want the story to spread. By 4:30 in the morning, reports were flooding back to the brownstone on 132nd Street. Teams checking in. Targets confirmed. Messages delivered. The Klan's New York operation was in shambles. Not destroyed. Bumpy was too smart for that. Total destruction would bring federal attention. Police investigations. Reporters asking questions. Instead, he'd done something more surgical. More permanent. He'd planted fear so deep it would never come out. At a warehouse in Long Island City, 8 Klan members had been caught mid-celebration. They'd been drinking, passing around photographs of the rhythm room burning, congratulating themselves on a successful mission. Bumpy's men had walked in like ghosts. The Klan members were stripped of their robes, stripped of their weapons, stripped of their dignity, then given a choice. Leave New York tonight, or be found by the police with evidence linking them to arson, federal crimes, prison time. Every single one chose the first option. In Astoria, 3 cars belonging to known Klan organizers were found stripped and burned. Not random vandalism. A mirror. A reflection of what they'd done to the rhythm room. but more controlled, more deliberate. The message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. In the Bronx, the printing shop where the Klan produced their recruitment materials was emptied. Every piece of literature, every membership list, every document that proved the organization's structure, gone. Some of it would be destroyed. Some of it would be kept. Insurance. Evidence for future leverage. Bumpy understood power better than most men. It wasn't just about violence. It was about information. Control. The ability to destroy someone's life with a phone call or a leaked document. Back at the brownstone, Bumpy sat in his office. The map on the wall was marked with red pins, each one representing a completed objective, each one representing a piece of the Klan's infrastructure that had been dismantled in less than 4 hours. Jericho entered, blood on his knuckles, exhaustion in his eyes, but also something else. Pride. It's done, he said. All targets accounted for. No casualties on our side. Police haven't responded to anything yet. Bumpy nodded. They won't. Not until morning. And by then, everyone will be gone. He stood, walked to the window. The sky was starting to lighten. That deep blue that comes before dawn. The city waking up, unaware of what had transpired in the darkness. What about Finch? Jericho asked. Bumpy smiled slightly. He'll be on a train by 6, heading back to Connecticut, and he'll never set foot in New York again. But there was one more piece, one more move to make. Because Bumpy didn't just want the Klan gone. He wanted everyone to know what happened when you came for Harlem. At 5 in the morning, a phone call was made to a reporter at the New York Amsterdam News, the city's leading black newspaper. The reporter was groggy, annoyed at being woken, until he heard what the caller had to say. The rhythm room had been burned by the KKK. That was news. But what happened next? The systematic dismantling of the Klan's New York operation in a single night. That was a story. The reporter started asking questions. The caller gave just enough detail, just enough to paint the picture, then hung up. By 7 in the morning, the story would be on desks. By noon, it would be on the streets. By evening, everyone in Harlem would know. Bumpy Johnson had struck back, and he'd won. But Bumpy knew something most people didn't understand. This wasn't really about revenge. It was about deterrence, about making sure this never happened again, about drawing a line so clear, so brutal, that no one would dare cross it. He'd spent years building his reputation, building his network, building the infrastructure that allowed him to move like this. And tonight, it had all paid off. The Klan had expected fear, expected submission, expected black people to scatter and hide. They'd gotten war, and they'd lost. At 5:30, Bumpy received the final report. Every Klan member who'd participated in the attack had been found. Some had fled the city already. Others were packing. A few were in hospitals. None of them would ever talk about what happened, because talking meant admitting they'd been beaten, humiliated, driven out by the very people they'd tried to terrorize. Bumpy walked out of the brownstone into the early morning air. The streets were quiet. A few early workers heading to jobs. A milk truck making deliveries. Normal life. Uninterrupted. That's what he'd fought for. Not glory. Not recognition. Just the ability for his people to live without fear. He walked toward Lenox Avenue, toward where the rhythm room had stood. The building was still smoldering. Firefighters had come eventually, put out the worst of it. But the structure was gone. Just blackened walls and broken dreams. Except they weren't broken. Not really. Because Bumpy was already planning to rebuild. Bigger. Better. A monument to the fact that you couldn't burn down a community. You couldn't destroy an idea. People were starting to gather. Neighbors. Musicians. Regular folks who'd made the rhythm room part of their lives. They looked at the ruins. Then at Bumpy. He didn't say anything. Didn't need to. They could see it in his eyes. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The sun broke over Harlem at 6:15. Golden lights spilling across brownstones and fire escapes, washing over streets that had witnessed something unprecedented. Word was already spreading, not through newspapers yet, through whispers, through the network of barbers and bartenders and street corner philosophers who knew everything before it became official. The Klan had come, and the Klan had been crushed. At the 28th precinct, police were receiving strange reports. Cars abandoned in Queens with burned white robes inside. A hotel room in Midtown trashed, but no one filing a complaint. Anonymous tips about men with suspected ties to hate groups fleeing the city on early morning trains. But no victims coming forward. No one pressing charges. The desk sergeant looked at the reports with confusion. Something had happened. Something big. But without complainants, without witnesses willing to talk, there was nothing to investigate. He filed the reports, marked them low priority, moved on. That's exactly what Bumpy had counted on. The Klan couldn't go to the police, couldn't admit they'd been targeted and beaten, couldn't explain why they were in New York organizing racial terror in the first place. Their silence was their prison. By 7 o'clock, the Amsterdam News had reporters on the street, interviewing people outside the rhythm room, getting reactions, building the story. An elderly woman who'd lived in Harlem for 40 years said it plainly. They thought they could come here and scare us. But we got Bumpy. And Bumpy don't scare. A young musician who'd played at the club the night before added his perspective. This isn't just about one man or one building. This is about respect, about standing up, about showing them we won't be pushed. The reporter pressed for details about what happened after the burning. People smiled, shrugged, said they'd heard things. Rumors. Stories about Klan members running scared. About white robes being torn off in warehouses. About threats being answered with something far more convincing than words. But no one had proof. No one was admitting to anything. Just knowing smiles and careful words. Meanwhile, Howard Finch was on a train heading south. His face was bruised. His ribs ached. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological damage. He'd spent his life believing in his own superiority, in the natural order that placed him above certain people. And in one night, that entire worldview had been shattered. He'd been powerless, helpless, at the mercy of a man he'd considered beneath him. The contradiction was eating him alive. His two bodyguards sat across from him, silent. They'd been professionals, trained, armed, and they'd been taken down in seconds. Neither of them would work for Finch again. Neither of them wanted to be associated with the humiliation. At Grand Central, 3 more Klan members boarded different trains, heading to Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, anywhere but New York, each carrying the same haunted expression, each knowing they'd crossed a line and paid a price they'd never forget. Back in Harlem, Bumpy returned to the brownstone. His men were exhausted, some sleeping in chairs, others nursing minor injuries. But the atmosphere was electric, victorious. They'd gone to war and won, not with endless resources or superior numbers, but with intelligence, coordination, and the absolute conviction that their home was worth fighting for. Bumpy gathered them one final time. What we did tonight doesn't leave this room, he said. The city will talk. Stories will spread. Let them. But we don't confirm. We don't brag. We don't give the law any reason to come asking questions. The men nodded. They understood. This was how you survived. How you operated in a world that wanted to destroy you. You moved in shadows. You struck hard. And you disappeared before anyone could build a case. The rhythm room will be rebuilt, Bumpy continued. Better than before. And when it opens, every person in Harlem is welcome. Because that's what this was really about. Our right to exist. Our right to build. Our right to live without terror. He paused. Let the words settle. They came for us thinking we were weak. Thinking we'd accept it. They learned different. And that lesson spreads today. To every white supremacist. To every person who thinks they can intimidate us. Harlem stands. And Harlem fights back. The room erupted in quiet affirmation. No cheering. No celebration. Just grim satisfaction. They'd done what needed to be done. By 9 in the morning, the story was everywhere. Barbershops, churches, pool halls, the burning of the rhythm room, and the mysterious events that followed. Some versions were accurate. Others were exaggerated. One story claimed Bumpy had personally fought 20 Klan members. Another said he'd burned down their headquarters in return. The truth was more subtle, more devastating. But the message was the same. You don't touch Harlem. You don't threaten its people. And you definitely don't test Bumpy Johnson. Because in 4 hours, he'd done what governments and laws and social movements had struggled to do for decades. He'd made racism expensive. He'd made hatred dangerous. He'd made bigots afraid. Not through speeches or protests or appeals to conscience. Through raw, calculated power. Through the understanding that some people only learn through pain. And through the willingness to teach that lesson thoroughly. The Klan never organized in Harlem again. Not because they'd been convinced they were wrong, but because they knew the cost. And that cost was too high. The days following the attack became legend. Not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The police investigation into the rhythm room fire lasted exactly 3 days. Arson was confirmed. Witnesses reported seeing men in white robes. But when detectives tried to follow leads, they hit walls. No one would testify. No physical evidence could be traced to specific individuals. The few Klan members still in the city suddenly had alibis, provided by lawyers who appeared out of nowhere with airtight stories. By the fourth day, the case was marked unsolved, filed away, forgotten by everyone except those who knew the real story. The insurance company balked at first, tried to claim the rhythm room fire was somehow Bumpy's fault. That changed when their investigators started receiving anonymous packages, photographs of their executives, home addresses, daily routines. Nothing threatening, just information, just a reminder that someone was watching. The claim was paid in full within 2 weeks. Construction on the new rhythm room began in October. Bumpy hired local workers, black contractors who'd been shut out of major projects across the city, carpenters, electricians, masons, men who took pride in rebuilding what hate had tried to destroy. The new building rose on the same spot, but bigger, 3 stories instead of 2. A proper stage with professional lighting, a kitchen that could serve full meals, and in the front window, a plaque. It didn't mention the fire, didn't mention the Klan, just said, built by Harlem. For Harlem, 1936. The opening night was planned for New Year's Eve. 3 months of construction compressed into a statement, a declaration that you couldn't keep Harlem down. Meanwhile, the ripple effects spread wider than anyone expected. The story reached other cities. Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, places where black communities faced similar threats. Similar organizations trying to intimidate them into submission. And everywhere the story traveled, it carried the same message. Fight back. Organize. Don't accept terror as inevitable. In Harlem itself, something shifted. The neighborhood had always been resilient, had always survived. But now there was an edge, a confidence. People walked differently, talked differently. The fear that had been building, that sense of vulnerability, evaporated. Because they'd seen what happened when someone pushed too far. They'd seen power meet power, and they'd seen their side win. Bumpy's reputation transcended the underworld. Mothers who'd never approved of gambling or numbers running quietly nodded when his name came up. Preachers who'd condemned vice from their pulpits admitted, in private conversations, that sometimes the Lord worked through unexpected vessels. He became more than a gangster. He became a symbol of resistance, of dignity, of the refusal to be a victim. But Bumpy himself remained unchanged, still conducted business from back rooms, still kept his emotions locked away, still moved through the city like a shadow. The only difference was the respect. Even cops who'd never taken his money treated him differently, not with friendship, but with acknowledgement. He'd done something they wouldn't. He protected a community when official channels had failed. In early November, Bumpy received an unexpected visitor. An older Italian man, dressed immaculately, accompanied by 2 bodyguards who waited outside. Don Luciano's representative. The mob had been watching, evaluating. The Italian families controlled most of New York's organized crime. They'd tolerated Bumpy in Harlem because he kept the peace, didn't expand into their territories, ran a tight operation. But what he'd done to the Klan was different. It showed capability, organization, reach. The representative got straight to business. The families want you to know they respect what you did, the way you handled it. Clean. No mess. No attention. Bumpy nodded. Waited. There was more coming. They also want you to know that Harlem is yours. Officially. No one moves in without your approval. No one operates without your say. It was recognition. Formal acknowledgement of what had been true informally for years. Bumpy controlled Harlem. Now the mob was putting their stamp on it. In return, the representative continued. They expect the same respect. No expansion. No conflicts. Business as usual. Bumpy considered this. It was both an honor and a cage. Security in exchange for boundaries. Tell them I accept, he said. Harlem is enough. It's always been enough. The representative smiled. Stood. Shook Bumpy's hand. One more thing. What you did. Word spread to other organizations. Other groups thinking about causing trouble. They're thinking twice now. That's good for business. Good for everyone. After he left, Bumpy sat alone in his office. He understood what had just happened. The Klan attack had been a test he hadn't asked for, but he'd passed it so decisively that it had reshaped the entire landscape. He was no longer just a local power. He was a force that even the Italian mob acknowledged. But he also understood the cost. The target on his back had grown. The expectations had increased. And the violence he'd unleashed, justified as it was, had opened doors that couldn't be easily closed. Still, given the choice again, he'd make the same decision. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. And some messages needed to be sent in a language everyone understood. Power. December came cold and sharp. Harlem prepared for winter the way it always did. Windows sealed against drafts. Cold deliveries for furnaces. Families huddling closer. But there was something different in the air. Hope mixed with defiance. The new rhythm room was nearly complete. Its frame stood tall against the winter sky. Workers moved with purpose. Every nail hammered was an act of resistance. Every beam raised was a middle finger to anyone who thought fire could erase what they'd built. Bumpy visited the site daily. Not to micromanage. Just to be present. To show the community this mattered. Sometimes he'd stand across the street. Watching. Remembering the old building. The music that had filled it. The lives that had intersected within its walls. The new version would be better. But something had been lost. Innocence, maybe. The belief that Harlem could exist peacefully if it just kept its head down. That illusion had burned along with the original structure. Now everyone understood the reality. They existed at the pleasure of no one. They existed because they demanded to. And they'd fight to keep existing. The musicians who'd played at the original club started planning the reopening night. Duke Ellington sent word he'd come down from the Cotton Club. Cab Calloway promised to make an appearance. These weren't just gestures of solidarity. They were statements. Harlem's cultural royalty claiming their space. Refusing to let terror define them. In mid-December, a journalist from the New York Times came to Harlem. White. Young. Eager. He'd heard stories about the rhythm room. About what happened that night in September. About the mysterious 4 hours that followed. He wanted the truth. Wanted Bumpy to go on record. Bumpy met him at a diner on 125th Street. Ordered coffee. Let the journalist ask his questions. Is it true you personally confronted the Klan leadership? The journalist asked. His notebook ready. Pen poised. Bumpy smiled slightly. I don't know what you've heard. But I was home that night. Sleeping. Woke up to news my club had burned. Terrible tragedy. The journalist tried again. Multiple sources say Klan members fled New York that same night. That there were coordinated attacks across the city. That, sources say a lot of things, Bumpy interrupted. People like stories. Especially dramatic ones. But if some troublemakers decided New York wasn't friendly to their particular brand of hate, well, can't say I'm sorry about that. The journalist understood he wasn't getting a confession. Wasn't getting the smoking gun. But he was getting something else. A glimpse of how power actually worked. Not in speeches or official channels. But in quiet rooms and unspoken understandings. His article ran 2 weeks later. Carefully worded. Noting the fire. Noting the Klan's presence in New York had diminished dramatically. Noting that community leaders like Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson had become more prominent. Never quite connecting the dots explicitly, but letting readers draw their own conclusions. The black newspapers were less subtle. The Amsterdam News ran a full feature. The night Harlem fought back. It included interviews with witnesses, accounts of the fire, and unnamed sources describing the swift justice that followed. The article ended with a simple statement. In Harlem, we protect our own. It became a rallying cry, printed on flyers, repeated in churches, whispered in schools. A reminder that resistance wasn't futile, that community could be armor, that standing together meant something. By Christmas, the new rhythm room was ready for its interior work. Bars installed, stage constructed, sound system being tested. Bumpy brought in the best craftsmen he could find, not because he needed the best, but because he wanted Harlem to see what they were capable of, what they could build when given the chance. On Christmas Eve, he held a small gathering at the construction site. No formal celebration, just workers, friends, community members who'd supported the rebuild. They stood in the unfinished space, breath visible in the cold air. And Bumpy spoke, not a speech, just words from a man who rarely revealed himself. This building is more than wood and brick, he said. It's proof. Proof that we're still here, still standing, still creating beauty in a world that tries to crush it. He paused, looked at the faces around him. What happened in September wasn't just about revenge. It was about drawing a line, saying this far and no further, saying we have value, we have worth, and we'll defend both. An old musician, saxophone case at his feet, spoke up. You gave us something to believe in, Bumpy. Showed us we don't have to accept what they try to give us. Bumpy shook his head. I didn't give you anything. You always had it. I just reminded you. The gathering dispersed quietly. People heading home to their families, to their own celebrations, but carrying something with them. A sense of possibility, of agency, the understanding that they weren't just victims of history. They were authors of it. New Year's Eve approached. The grand opening was set. Invitations went out across Harlem, across New York, even to people who'd never set foot in the neighborhood. Because the Rhythm Room wasn't just a club anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of Black excellence, of the fact that you could burn a building, but you couldn't burn a spirit. Bumpy knew the attention would bring complications. More scrutiny, more jealousy, more people wanting a piece of what he'd built. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, standing in the skeleton of the Rhythm Room, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He'd protected his home. He'd sent his message. And he'd survived to see it received. New Year's Eve 1936 arrived with snow. Soft flakes drifting down over Harlem, covering the streets in white, transforming the neighborhood into something almost magical. By 6 in the evening, people were already lining up outside the Rhythm Room. The new building glowed, lights strung across the facade, windows revealing glimpses of the polished interior, music drifting out even before the official opening. The crowd was unlike anything Harlem had seen. Working-class families dressed in their Sunday best, musicians carrying instruments, business owners, teachers, preachers, even a few politicians who decided this was the place to be seen. But also the underground, the numbers runners, the hustlers, the people who lived in the shadows but called Harlem home. Everyone was welcome. That had always been Bumpy's rule. And tonight, it mattered more than ever. Inside, the transformation was complete. The main floor featured a dance area 3 times larger than the original. The stage could accommodate a full jazz orchestra. The bar ran the entire length of the back wall. Mirrors and polished wood everywhere. Elegant without being pretentious. The basement level housed private booths. A smaller stage for intimate performances. And in the back, Bumpy's office. Reinforced. Secure. A command center disguised as a business space. At 7 o'clock, the doors opened. The crowd surged in. First reactions were audible. Gasps. Exclamations. Pride. This wasn't just nice. This was world-class. This was the kind of establishment white folks downtown paid premium prices for. And it was theirs. Built by their community. For their community. Duke Ellington's orchestra took the stage at 8. The first notes of Sophisticated Lady filled the space. People stopped talking. Just listened. The sound quality was perfect. Every instrument clear. Every note resonating. This was what the Rhythm Room had always aspired to be. Bumpy watched from his usual spot. Back corner table. Positioned to see both the entrance and the emergency exits. Old habits. Jericho stood nearby. Curtis roamed the floor. Security was tight, but invisible. No one wanted trouble. But if trouble came, they were ready. As the night progressed, something remarkable happened. The divisions that usually separated Harlem began to blur. The respectable middle class mingled with street hustlers. Church ladies danced alongside nightclub performers. The music created a temporary space where everyone was just people, just neighbors, just survivors of the same struggle. Around 10 o'clock, a commotion at the door. Bumpy's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. But it wasn't trouble. It was unexpected guests. 3 Italian men in expensive suits. Bumpy recognized one of them. Frank Costello, one of the most powerful mob bosses in New York, coming to Harlem, to the Rhythm Room, to pay respects. Costello approached Bumpy's table. Respectful, but not deferential. Beautiful place, he said. Heard about it. Wanted to see for myself. Bumpy gestured to the empty chairs. You're welcome here. Tonight, everyone is. They sat, ordered drinks, and for 20 minutes, 2 of New York's most powerful underworld figures talked. Not about business, not about territories, about music, about neighborhoods, about what it meant to build something that mattered. When Costello left, he shook Bumpy's hand. What you did in September, that was impressive, professional. The families remember things like that. It was another acknowledgement, another layer of respect earned. But Bumpy knew it was also a reminder. They were watching, always watching. Midnight approached. The crowd grew louder, more celebratory. 1936 had been hard. Depression still gripping the country. Racism still crushing opportunities. But they'd survived. And this place, this beautiful space rising from ashes, was proof. At 11:55, the music stopped. Bumpy stood, walked to the stage. He wasn't a public speaker, didn't like attention, but tonight required words. The crowd quieted. Hundreds of faces turned toward him. This building almost didn't exist, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Some people thought they could erase it, thought they could scare us into hiding, into accepting less. He paused. Let that sink in. They were wrong. And this place is proof. Proof that we build, we create, we survive, and we do it with style. Laughter. Applause. The rhythm room isn't mine. It belongs to Harlem. To every person who refused to give up, who refused to accept someone else's vision of what we deserve. The crowd roared. So when midnight comes, when we step into 1937, remember this moment. Remember that we decided our own fate. We wrote our own story, and we'll keep writing it. Together. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Voices joining. Building. 7, 6, 5. Energy crackling through the room. 4, 3, 2, 1. Explosions of joy. Hugs. Kisses. Strangers embracing. The orchestra launched into Auld Lang Syne, but with a jazz arrangement that made it feel new, made it feel like hope. Bumpy returned to his table, watched the celebration, and for the first time in months, allowed himself to relax. The message had been sent. The line had been drawn. Harlem stood, and anyone who doubted that could look at the rhythm room and understand. You couldn't burn down a dream. You couldn't destroy a community's will to exist. You could only make them stronger, more determined, more unified. That was the real victory. Not what happened in those 4 hours in September, but what happened after. The rebuilding, the resilience, the refusal to be defined by trauma. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the city, covering the past. And inside the rhythm room, Harlem danced into a new year. Unbroken, unbowed, undeniable. The years that followed proved Bumpy's instincts right. The rhythm room became more than a nightclub. It became an institution, a landmark, a place where Harlem's story was written in music and conversation and community. But the real impact wasn't the building. It was the precedent. After September 1936, organized white supremacist activity in Harlem effectively ceased. The Klan tried to recruit in other New York neighborhoods, Brooklyn, the Bronx. But Harlem remained untouched, untouchable. The story of what happened spread through supremacist circles like a virus. Whispered warnings, cautionary tales. Don't go to Harlem. Don't test Bumpy Johnson. The cost is too high. It wasn't fear of one man. It was fear of what he represented. An organized, determined community that refused to be victimized, that fought back with precision and without mercy, that turned the tables so completely that the aggressors became the hunted. Other cities took note. In Chicago, when the Klan threatened black neighborhoods, community leaders studied Bumpy's response. The coordination, the intelligence gathering, the swift, decisive action. They adapted those lessons to their own situations. In Detroit, Philadelphia, even some southern cities, the story inspired resistance. Not always violent, but always organized, always strategic, always sending the message that black communities wouldn't accept terror as inevitable. Bumpy himself never spoke publicly about what happened that night. Never confirmed, never denied. He understood that mystery was more powerful than facts. That legend carried weight that truth sometimes couldn't. When reporters asked, he'd smile. Change the subject. Talk about the Rhythm Room's latest show. About Harlem's cultural contributions. About anything except those 4 hours. But everyone knew. And knowing was enough. By 1940, the Rhythm Room was hosting some of the biggest names in jazz. Billie Holiday, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie. It became a required stop for any musician who mattered. And every performance carried the unspoken history. This stage existed because someone fought for it. This music played because someone refused to let silence win. Bumpy's criminal empire continued. He never pretended to be a saint. Still ran numbers. Still collected from gambling operations. Still operated in the shadows. But he also became something else. A protector. A power broker. Someone who kept Harlem stable when the rest of the city churned with conflict. The police learned to work around him. The politicians learned to consult him. The community learned to trust him in ways that transcended traditional morality. Because morality, they understood, was complicated. The law hadn't protected them when the Klan came. The government hadn't intervened. But Bumpy had, and that loyalty ran deep. In 1945, when World War II ended and soldiers returned home, many of them black veterans who'd fought for a country that still denied them basic rights, they came to Harlem. They came to the Rhythm Room. And they heard the story. About the night someone fought back. About the 4 hours that changed everything. It gave them hope. Reminded them that resistance was possible. That dignity could be defended. That the struggle wasn't futile. Bumpy aged. The sharp edges softened slightly. But the core remained. The willingness to do what others wouldn't. The understanding that sometimes justice came from outside official channels. The commitment to protecting his community at any cost. He trained younger men. Passed on lessons. Not just about crime or survival. About strategy. About thinking 3 moves ahead. About understanding that real power wasn't about violence. It was about information. Control. The ability to make others think twice before acting. By the 1960s, when the civil rights movement reached its peak, young activists would sometimes reference that night in 1936. Not as a model to follow exactly, but as proof that black people had always fought back. Had always refused to accept oppression quietly. Had always found ways to resist. Malcolm X, who spent time in Harlem, knew the story. Spoke about it in private. About how his people had always been warriors. Always been strategic. Always been more than the victims white America tried to portray. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968. Heart attack. Sudden. On a Harlem street he'd walked 1,000 times. But his legacy lived on. The Rhythm Room continued for decades. Different owners. Different eras. But always carrying the weight of its history. And the story of those 4 hours in September 1936 became myth. Passed down through generations. Sometimes accurate. Sometimes embellished. But always carrying the same essential truth. That Bumpy Johnson had drawn a line. That he'd defended it with everything he had. That he'd won. The Klan never returned to Harlem. Not in any organized way. Not with the confidence they'd had before. Because they'd learned what Bumpy always knew. That underestimating people because of their race was a fatal mistake. That communities pushed hard enough would push back harder. That terror only worked when the terrorized accepted their role. Harlem never accepted that role. Not then. Not ever. And while many factors contributed to that resistance, those 4 hours mattered. They showed what was possible. What happened when someone refused to be a victim. When someone fought back with intelligence and determination and absolute commitment. The Rhythm Room still stands today. Different now. Renovated. Modernized. But on the wall, that same plaque remains. Built by Harlem. For Harlem. 1936. And everyone who sees it knows. Knows the fire. Knows the response. Knows that sometimes, in 4 hours, one man can change everything.